All right, good evening, everybody. We're waiting for the last few to come down and find seats. It's great. We've got participants and attendees of all ages. If you guys didn't get a clipboard with some pictures to color, there's stuff in the back. Aaron, there's one for you too. We got the special colors. Yeah. All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Good, excellent. So I've got some great news. We have Professor Matt Kelley, sorry. I've got Patsy Owens, who unfortunately was not able to join us tonight. But Matt has some exciting things to share for us as well. And before we get started with that, though, I wanted to welcome you all. This is actually the 10th year that Conversations regarding Tacoma has been here in town, and in part largely to the vision of Co Wibowo over at McGranahan Architects and all the other wonderful designers and architects and interested residents here in town. I want to also say thank you to our Leader in Tacoma sponsors tonight. We have McGranahan Architects as well, BCRA, BLRB Architects, TCF Architecture, BCE Engineers, Hargis Engineers, and of course the Harris Architectural Grant through the AIA has been able to support us for the last few years, and we're incredibly grateful for that. I also want to tell you about our upcoming events. October 18th is the next one. And again, all of these are surrounding children and design. And the next one will be at Rain, which is just up here on Fawcett. And the event after that is November 1st at the 1120 Creative House. And with that, I want to kick us off. We've got Matthew Kelley, not Patsy Kelley, thank you. Matt. And Matt is an associate professor at the Urban Studies department here with the University of Washington, Tacoma. He's got a background in community development and GIS, Geographic Information Systems. He directs and teaches undergraduate and graduate students. And he is, I love this, fascinated by maps, spatial data, and new information technologies. And hopefully all of that comes across tonight with all of the exciting things he has to share. I'll let him talk a little bit more about AMP, which is the recent project he's working on. And I also just want to say, by all the faculty at UW-T, he definitely has the best style and swagger, and I'm sure that'll come across tonight. So with that, anything, fire exits in the back. We'll do questions at the end. We've got about 45 minutes of presentation and then about 30 minutes of questions. So hold on to all of those. And if there's any other emergencies, hold on to them or leave. But we hope you stay. So Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think, I think this one will work. Okay. Okay. So everybody hear me okay? Yeah, my voice will get louder as I begin talking. Thank you all for coming to see me. I'm not Patsy Owens, but I hope that I'll be almost as interesting to you all. It's great to see some kids in the audience. That's fantastic. The one thing that I think doesn't come through in my bio and that I think is important to note, just because it's nice to contextualize who you're hearing from, I have a gaggle of children of my own, 11 and under, and I can count them on one hand. But so youth is very much a part of my everyday life. Youth is very much a part of my research. And I think that as I'm talking tonight, you should get a sense for what I'm doing. So like Josh said, I'll be talking about AMP. This is the Action Mapping Project. Some of you may have seen me talk about this in other venues. So hopefully it's different enough tonight that I'll keep your attention. We're doing some interesting things this year, really expanding the project in interesting ways that I'm excited to share with you all. Now, like Josh said, I'm a professor in urban studies at UW-T. I got here about 10 years ago, here meaning Tacoma. Before that, I was in Philly doing community development while I was doing my doctoral work, and then in Los Angeles years and years ago, working with Ali, who thrust me into a community development organization back when I was very young and told me, here, go do GIS, learn how to do it, and work in community development. And it was a fantastic, life-changing moment in the late 90s that really set me up for where I am today. So thank you, Ali, I'm excited to talk to you more. Now, I like community development. I think it's important. I'm even more passionate, though, about issues of livability, the ways that we make our cities and neighborhoods better places to live. Community development can get very technocratic, but livability, when you get down to it, means something special, and that's important to me. God, I do this every time. I want to set a timer so that I keep track of where I'm at. So I should be more well prepared. Otherwise, I'll just ramble for a long time. There we go. Well, now I know where I should be. So there we go. Okay. So livability is something I think a lot about. It's what we do when we do community development. When you're designing, when you're planning, when you're placemaking, you're thinking about livability. We need to make our neighborhoods better places for us all to live in. That doesn't mean better places just for old folks or young folks or middle-aged folks or upper middle class folks, for all of us. And it's challenging to capture all those different perspectives when we do community development, or when you are designing, or when you're placemaking. And of course, design is central to everything I do. Now, I recognize that I'm talking to a room full of designers, architects, or folks that are interested in these things, and I make no claim to be a designer. It fascinates me. I wish I could draw better. I wish I were a designer. I appreciate good design, but I'm not a designer. I'm a spatial scientist. I'm passionate about innovative, participatory approaches to community development. I very much like to get down in the dirt and involve people in the projects that I do, because I think that we should all have a hand in making our homes and neighborhoods better places. In my work, I focus largely on matters of access. Okay, so access is an important concept. This could be access to food. This could be access to public transportation. This could be access to education or healthcare. Right? Access. Access is essentially synonymous with equity. So when we think about designing for equity, or planning or placemaking for equity, what we're really talking about is access to those essential parts of our everyday life that we have to have access to. And if we don't, then we aren't living in an equitable society. How we define access matters. Okay, so whether you're a placemaker, a designer, a planner, no matter what you call yourself, how you define access matters. Because access isn't necessarily a spatial concept. Of course, distance matters. I'm a spatial scientist. I do GIS. Right? I teach young people at the university how to make maps, how to analyze spatial data. But I will be the first one to tell you that distance isn't the only thing that matters. In fact, distance is often far less significant than other sociocultural landscapes or dynamics, whatever you want to call them, that are invisible to the data that we have at hand. Living next to a park, in theory, is far better than living 10 miles away from the nearest park. Being able to walk to a grocery store, in theory, is better than living 20 miles away from the nearest grocery store. But if for whatever reason I am unable to access that park, I'm unable to access that grocery store, my kids can't use that park, then they don't have access. Whether it's across the street and they can see it, but they refuse to use it, or whether there's a freeway between me and that park. A lot of times when I'm teaching my students how to analyze spatial data, we go through a process analyzing where parks are in the city of Tacoma, where people are in the city of Tacoma, where disadvantaged neighborhoods are in the part of the city of Tacoma, and we think about who has access to parks. What % of the population has access, meaning they're within a walking distance of a park? That tells us part of the story. What it doesn't tell us is what are the sociocultural barriers? Where are the gang territories, right? Where are the high traffic streets, the streets that prevent kids from crossing them? Where are the parks that have a mythology attached to them, which makes them tremendously inaccessible to our kids because they're scared of stories they hear at school about that particular park? Okay, those are the barriers that don't show up in data. And those are the barriers that makes access very complicated. And it makes it very difficult to design. If you're designing a park, and I'm talking about parks. Parks are easy. I like talking about parks, probably because I have kids and we go to parks a lot. But if you're designing a park and you put that park at the top of a mountain, you build a moat around that park, it could be the most amazing park on the planet. Great playground equipment, open space, basketball courts, whatever. It's a fantastic park, but it's on top of a mountain with a moat around it. Nobody can get to it. It's pointless. It's a bad investment. Could be good design, but it's totally ineffective. Why'd you put the park on top of a mountain where it's inaccessible? Maybe nearby to a lot of people, but it's not accessible. With AMP, with the Action Mapping Project, I'm working with agencies, with youth, with undergraduates to generate new forms of data, quantitative data about access, so that we're better able to make informed decisions about how and where we deploy our placemaking skills, our good design, our planning practice, right? Because the point of GIS, the point of what I do is to generate data to inform the decisions that you all get to make when you're designing something, when you're investing money in something. Now, my work on the action mapping project is the culmination of many, many years of experimentation. I started doing this, well, I don't even know, 20 years ago, messing around with sketch mapping, and that's what we do. When I got here to Tacoma about 10 years ago, I started working with Youth United at the United Way, doing sketch mapping. Work with kids at the School of the Arts, sketch mapping downtown. Work with some kids in Federal Way to sketch map their neighborhoods. Along the way, I've been thinking more and more about how we engage kids, our youth, in the practice of community development that gets them excited and gives them a sense of ownership over the process. Because the end of this process isn't necessarily data. The end is a new generation of placemakers, a new generation of people who are passionate about making a difference in their own neighborhoods. Like I put up on the screen, I find time and time again that youth have unique, unseen, and unknown everyday experiences. And without understanding these experiences, without that knowledge, we're making decisions for youth. Okay? That's classical planning practice. We tend to make decisions for people. If we can generate knowledge about the lives of our youth, then the decisions that we make become collaborative. And that's key. Collaborative decision making means that lots of people are invested in the process, and the process yields better results. We're designing then, we're planning then, we're improving our everyday spaces with rather than for our kids. And that's something that we should all be striving for. That's something I strive for. That's something I would hope you all want to do. The more participatory and collaborative the process, the more effective the design becomes. To that end, the Action Mapping Project is essentially a community mapping project, and I'll talk about what that means. There's some discrete outcomes that are not map-based. AMP is an educational project. The educational outcomes of this project are really exciting, just a little less visible. And AMP is also designed to empower youth, to cultivate, again, that next generation of placemakers in the South Sound. The pictures that you're seeing on the screen, by the way, throughout the slideshow are just pictures from the project in action at various schools. And you'll hear more about what all this is. So AMP empowers youth by giving them an opportunity to lead. So we're making youth leaders in this project. We give them a voice in the decisions that get made about their neighborhood. Those are the desirable outcomes of the project. We want to empower youth. We want to give them voice, to amplify their voice. And we do this using fairly classical methods. I'm using sketch mapping. Sketch mapping, for the uninitiated, means that I or my students show up to a room full of people, kind of like yourself, with a piece of paper and a set of Sharpies, and I give each one of you a piece of paper. On that paper is a very bare bones map of your neighborhood, streets and a few landmarks, enough that you can orient yourself. The Sharpies, red, blue, green, black. You have 4 colors. Sit you down and ask you some questions. Where do you spend time when you're not at work or at school? What routes do you tend to use? Parts of your neighborhood you tend to avoid. Don't write responses, draw responses. Okay? That's what all these kids are doing in these pictures. They're drawing responses to questions in a sketch mapping workshop. It's fun. And I'm working with middle school and high school aged youth in Tacoma currently. So once kids begin to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, they get really invested in the process. They have fun with it. None of these kids did I ask to start mugging with their maps, but they did, because they get proud of being a part of something that's bigger than them. And I don't think that very often we trust our kids enough to make them a part of a process that's bigger than them. To this date, thousands and thousands of these maps have been drawn, and we're analyzing those maps to generate big data about youth experience. These big data are aggregate data about youth experience, youth perception, youth activity space in Tacoma. This past year, we worked with about 3,000 middle school and high school aged kids in the Lincoln catchment area. I'll explain the process. That's a lot of data. So much so that it's statistically significant. I can tell you pretty specific things about how kids are experiencing the Lincoln neighborhood, and kids are excited to be a part of it. Now, working with youth is not a novel concept. I didn't invent this, you didn't invent this. It's been going on for eons, and it will happen for eons. We're always going to try to work with youth. In the last 10 years, though, there's been a good deal of effort put into developing programs and practices that are more youth inclusive. I mean, that's the Regarding Tacoma lecture series this year. We're focusing on youth. UNICEF has suggested that every child and young person has the right to grow up in an environment where they feel safe and secure, where they have access to basic services and clean air and water, where they can play, where they can learn and grow, and where their voice is heard and it matters. I've got some other examples up here. Spatial Stories of Dublin's Youth is just a random example of a photo voice project. This is a project in which kids are given cameras, they walk around town taking pictures. Those pictures become a part of a data set that tell us things about kids' everyday experience, their everyday lives. Berkeley has established the Center for Cities and Schools. This center is connecting municipalities with schools in order to teach kids at a young age how cities become what they are, why their neighborhoods are or are not what they want them to be, and how you can get more invested in the process. It's important to cultivate, again, in our kids a sense of placemaking. And it's not hard to do. The Child in the City Foundation is a broadly focused international group. It's somewhat obscure, but what they do is bring together academics and practitioners by understanding that working with kids is challenging. I am currently in the process of hiring some new graduate students and undergraduate students. I have lots of students who are very technically savvy. I have students who, oddly enough, are on the same page as me when it comes to community development and livability. They're just as out there as I am. What's challenging is finding that student who is able to walk into a middle school classroom at First Creek Middle School and feel comfortable enough to start talking to middle schoolers, or to walk into a room full of high schoolers at Foss and lead that room. It's not something that we're necessarily born with. I mean, you become better at working with kids when you're around kids more, but it's very challenging to teach somebody how to be good with kids. So one of the points of the Child in the City Foundation is to share those experiences, to talk about how do we work with youth? How do we make sure that the youth don't feel used and objectified by the process, but they're made to be a part of the process. They're made to be empowered by the process. And that's a challenge. Now, all of this is happening. And I'd argue, and I'll tell you why I'd argue this, that the scope of AMP is different than any other project like this in the world. And AMP is ambitious. The Action Mapping Project is, I think it's very likely that we achieve most of our outcomes, but it's, we're trying to do a lot. We're working with 85 to 90% of all middle school and high school aged youth in the Tacoma public school system. Last year it was 3,000 kids in the Lincoln catchment area. This year we're looking at expanding that to 8,000 kids between Lincoln, Foss, and Mount Tacoma. That's a lot of youth that we're involving in our process. The project, as we build out, consists of establishing community mapping centers in each one of the Tacoma public high schools. This year we're establishing centers at Lincoln, at Foss, and Mount Tacoma. Each one of those centers is staffed not by me, but by high school students who are mentored, who are taught, who are led by an undergraduate from UW-Tacoma. So these are centers that are staffed and led by youth. Okay? I'm working with those youth, but increasingly as the project builds out, this is the youth project. This is a project that I'm helping with, but I'm making sure that the kids can move forward. These kids are being trained to do very scientific work at their schools. One trap that academics tend to fall into is we have fancy equipment at universities. We have nice computers, beautiful lab spaces. You come here and you think, wow, you know, if we all had that kind of equipment, we could change the world. Kids don't have that. In distressed communities, you have what you have at a high school. Most high schools have adequate equipment to do the sort of work that we're doing. So we're going to schools using their equipment. We're teaching kids not that they have to go someplace with better equipment, but they can leverage their own resources. right? Their own tools to make a difference in their neighborhoods. So we're using lab spaces, computers at their schools. We're using rooms at their schools. And we're creating pathways to education. There's direct pathways between the Action Mapping Project community mapping teams and the urban studies programs in urban design, in GIS and spatial planning, and community development. So as kids become more invested in this practice, there are opportunities for them to continue doing this, learning this, becoming leaders as placemakers. And then we're working with agencies to ensure that data that are generated by youth are leveraged to improve neighborhoods. And this is a part of the project that I'm excited to see come to fruition this year. In the summer of 2019, we'll be running our first series of what are called AMP camps. My students have helped very much naming these things, though it is kind of catchy. So we'll be running AMP camps this summer, and the output, the goal of those camps is to generate some actionable plans, and I'll talk about those in a little while. Now, of all of our outcomes, I think that the data that we collect and release is most visible, and that's most exciting. It's most sexy because it looks cool. Our first set of data, first complete set of data for the Lincoln catchment area should be rolling out this autumn. Again, that represents the experience, the perception, the activity of about 3,000 middle school and high school aged kids in the Lincoln High School catchment area. I'm talking about catchment areas, by the way, just a quick side note, because when we do community development, we have to define neighborhoods. I'm using catchment areas because they're somewhat organic boundaries that kids can identify with when we talk to them. I'm not using City of Tacoma defined boundaries because kids, quite honestly, don't identify with Central Tacoma or South Tacoma or East Side, but they do identify with their catchment areas. They come from those neighborhoods. So they're very useful, organic polygons, areas for us to work within, hence the Lincoln catchment area. Now, we're producing these data by providing youth with the opportunity to share their experiences, their perceptions, their uses of their own neighborhood spaces. So these are spaces kids are comfortable with. They're drawing on maps, and then we're taking all those maps and generating a massive set of data that really include key indicators. So this is a new form of indicator data that are coming out of our process that you'll see in just a little while. I said that there's educational outcomes. In high schools at our community mapping centers, and this is the first year we're rolling these out, our plan is to teach high school students how to, quote unquote, do GIS. There's debates about what doing GIS means, but essentially we're teaching high school students our intro-level GIS, Geographic Information Systems course at their schools during their after-school program. It's exciting. High school students don't typically have an opportunity to learn what a GIS is, learn how to make maps, learn how to analyze spatial data. This is new. It's STEAM education in the most serious way. We're teaching the science, the technology, the engineering outputs, the art of cartography. This is all bound up in GIS, and I'm working closely with career and technical education within the Tacoma Public Schools to make this happen. And they're excited, I'm excited, and I'm very excited to see how the kids react to this material. So we're developing the curriculum as I speak. Now, not only will high school students be trained to do GIS in their schools, but they'll also be provided with, like I said, pathways to higher education in urban studies. So again, we're cultivating that next generation of placemakers in the project. And we have some really interesting programs in the urban studies division at UW Tacoma that is cranking out. Josh is one of our products. And Josh makes us all proud every time we see him. So that's the sort of work that we do in urban studies, and as students get invested in this and meet the professors that are at urban studies, meet the students that we produce at urban studies, I'm hopeful that high school students want to do more of this at UW Tacoma and see this as a great opportunity. Finally, the overarching goal of the Action Mapping Project is to manifest positive change in our urban neighborhoods. That's the point, whether that's by cultivating new leaders, whether that's by generating data or surfacing opportunities for investment in good design. What we want to do is make our neighborhoods more livable. And we're working to do that by generating a never-before-seen set of spatial data about the everyday lives of youth. And then we're deploying those data, again, this coming summer in community meetings, at which we'll be working with the health department. So we're generating new data. There is no data set like this in the world. It's data about youth experience. It's qualitative data that's been generated to a scale which results in quantitative spatial data, and I'll show you what they look like. But really what we're talking about are surfacing opportunities to invest in very specific, discrete parts of our neighborhoods, and the health department has been and continues to be, I think, excited about working with the project to organize groups in each one of our catchment areas next summer to identify a project and then identify funding for that project. So the plan is not that we produce data and walk away. The plan is that we produce data and work with youth and residents to leverage those data to advocate for improvement in their neighborhoods. And that's what makes the project special, is it's actionable. We want to focus resources in a very discrete and explicit way. Now the nitty-gritty. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the nitty-gritty. AMP centers and AMP community mapping teams, like I said, are being established in high schools this year. Those teams are charged with a couple of things. Beginning in the winter term, each one of our community mapping teams is responsible for running sketch mapping workshops, which I'll talk about in a moment, at their high school and all of the middle schools in their high school's catchment area. So for Lincoln High School, the Lincoln community mapping team will run sketch mapping workshops with all of the Lincoln High School students, with all of the Stewart Middle School students, with all the First Creek Middle School students, and all of the Giardroni Middle School students. Now, Grant, I know Baker also bleeds into to Lincoln, but we're working with just middle schools that exist within the catchment. So there's a little bit of fudging there. That's a lot of kids. That means that our community mapping teams are being trained to facilitate workshops, and our community mapping teams are being trained to do GIS, to digitize the maps that are produced. And I'll show you what that looks like. And they're excited. The teachers that we're working with at the high schools are excited. It's complicated and ridiculously complicated, actually, to roll this out. I had no idea. But I think it's rolling out in a positive way. And by November 1st, I think we'll be in all 3 schools. And again, this is youth-led. So this is a project that's very much of by and for the youth. We're letting youth take the reins and seeing where it goes. The process to generate data is a result of many years of pilot work. We began with sketch mapping workshops. These are examples of sketch maps. I'll show you some bigger examples of sketch maps in a moment, but suffice to say, those maps represent youth experience, youth perception, youth activity space. At workshops, youth respond to questions not only about their activities, but also about themselves. We're generating demographic data and a little bit of qualitative data. I'll show you some samples of that. Step 2, we've got to digitize all these things and analyze all these things. Producing pieces of paper is interesting, and the paper is fascinating to look at, but I'll explain to you why that's not an end in and of itself, really, at all. So we have to digitize and analyze. We model all of the data that are analyzed in a GIS. It's a statistical model that produces what's essentially a heat map. And the heat map looks like a map of where the kids are or where the kids are not. From that heat map, it's actually quite easy to uncover and make visible opportunities for investment or design or placemaking in our neighborhoods. So at sketch mapping workshops, we show up typically in a class. We've experimented with different models of this. Aaron was present when we actually worked with many classes at an elementary school. But we've refined the process over the years, and we now work with classrooms, about 20 kids at a time. And those kids are asked to respond to a series of questions about their everyday lives. These are just some examples. Some of their responses are inclusive of the entire map. Some of them are very small. We ask them things like, take out your red pen. Now think about the routes that you avoid when you're walking around your neighborhood. Trace those routes. Not the routes that you don't use, but the routes, the pathways, the trails that you avoid, that you go out of your way to avoid. Take out your blue pen. Draw outlines around the areas where you spend time during the day when you're not at school, when you're not at home, because that's important to know. Take out your green pen. Think about how you get from your house to your friend's house, from your house to school, to the market, to the park, wherever you're hanging out. Draw green lines to trace those trails, those paths, those sidewalks, whatever routes you take. So we ask them a series of questions. The responses to those questions are drawing, and they draw on their maps. And some include a lot of data, some don't include a lot of data. But honestly, it doesn't matter, because we're not, the project doesn't hinge on one map being excellent, or even 20 maps being excellent. When we're collecting 3,000 maps from a catchment area, it's okay to have a few clunkers, because we've got a lot of data. Now, the workshops are youth-led. I have been there. I started this. I've kind of tested the methods, and now I'm handing it off. But they're youth-led now. Members of the AMP team are being trained to facilitate these workshops. So these are high school students talking to high school students. Last year, we had middle school students talking to middle school students. That was interesting. It turns out that middle school student girls are far more confident standing up in front of a room running a survey. The boys were a disaster. And this is the learning process. We've learned that we can't really use middle school mapping teams. We have to use high school mapping teams, because in general, there's a lot more confidence and ability there, just as they age. And I could walk you through these. Again, though, the red, no-go, the green are paths that are used. Blue outlines, places they hang out. X's are assets. We ask kids, what's important to you? What's important to your community? So we ask a series of questions, and that results in lots of drawings. Now, this is interesting. A typical participatory mapping project, and I didn't invent this. I honestly don't know who invented this. It's been used for years. There were people doing this hundreds of years ago, but it's been refined over the years, the process of participatory mapping, getting people to take what's in their head and put on a piece of paper, their spatial imaginaries, okay? Usually you work with a group about your size. Now, probably a little smaller even. And the outcome of that is paper. And then we sit together, or maybe a subset of us, or maybe a few researchers sit together, you put all the paper on the ground, and you look at it. And you talk to each other, and you look at it some more, and you use your eyeballs and your brain to identify patterns. Because we can do that for a dozen or 2 dozen maps. You can look across a series of pieces of paper, and any one of you can see patterns. I can guarantee none of you can see patterns across 3,000 pieces of paper. It's not possible. And that's the magic that we have to bring to the project. So we're generating data at an entirely different scale now. 3,000 for one catchment area, and that's an annual process. We're doing this every year. That's a lot of paper. So we can't look at those. 85 to 90% of youth at build out, I think we're working with somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 kids every year. So we need models. Our AMP teams are charged with doing that. So every single one of these pieces of paper gets digitized. That means we scan in this piece of paper to a computer, shows up in our GIS, and one of our mapping team members gets to trace every single line, every single shape on that map that has been drawn. Every single line becomes a piece of what we call vector data. Okay? That's data that we can analyze. Every single shape becomes what we call a polygon. That's more vector data. We can analyze those. That's exciting. That's taking information from kids' heads, their imaginations, and turning it into quantifiable statistical data that we can analyze and generate aggregate information about youth experience, youth perception, youth activity. And to my knowledge, this is not happening anywhere at this scale. Now, alongside their map, because we're generating so much data, we've added some demographic identifiers. We asked the kids to tell us a little bit about themselves. All of these are anonymous. Nowhere does a kid write their name, although kids are so used to writing their names that half of them do write their names, and we just end up having to Sharpie those out. But we asked them to tell us a little bit about themselves, because with 3,000 pieces of data, if you want to know the difference between the experience of an African-American girl who's under the age of 16 and a Caucasian boy who's under the age of 16 in the Lincoln catchment area, probably tell you that, because we have 2 sets of data which reflect both of those sets of experiences, both of those sets of perceptions, and they're different, right? And that's important to know. So we're generating demographic data alongside our mapping data, and those all get combined in our database on the back end. We're also asking a couple of qualitative questions. If you can't read these, one of them says, what do you do in the 2 to 3 hours after school? In talking to administrators and having kids and knowing people with kids, the time of day when kids are most likely to get themselves in trouble is in the 2 to 3 hours after school. Why is that? Yeah, nobody's home. The kids got nothing better to do, so they get themselves in trouble. So we kind of want, what are you doing after school? We also ask kids how you feel about where you are and what you're doing. Some kids write a sentence, some kids write a word. It's interesting data. The goal with these data, and this is new to the project, these data are being input to a database and will ultimately be analyzed textually to tease out themes, common themes amongst subgroups of kids, amongst catchment areas. Ultimately, I want to know the difference between Lincoln and Stadium. I want to know the difference between kids who live in the North End and kids who live in East Side. And ultimately, at Build Out, we should be able to tell you that. We should be able to tell you, as things change in neighborhoods, how that affects that level of access and equity across our neighborhoods in Tacoma. These maps that I'm going to talk through now are the results of pilot work. Okay, so I don't have maps that look like this from our last year's work. These are the result of 600 students who participated in a pilot project a couple of years ago, and I'll explain what they are. The map that you're looking at here represents routes that kids in the Lincoln catchment area, and actually for this project we only worked with Lincoln and Stewart kids, and about, we worked with the entire school at Stewart Middle School and about 300 kids at Lincoln. So it's a pretty good sample of kids from those schools. So what routes do you use when you're walking or biking? Now, when a kid participates in the survey, what they do is draw on a map, and then we digitize those data. And the output of our model, of our analysis, is this. Darker areas, darker streets, are those streets or segments of streets where more lines have been drawn. Okay? So Pacific Avenue it's dark green, right? It's heavily used. Most kids drew lines on Pacific Avenue, and when we analyze those data, this is the output of that analysis. There's segments of streets. There was quite a bit of drawing happening here. So there's discrete parts of streets that, for one reason or another, had a greater response rate than other segments of streets. Ultimately, this is a map, and we can look at this and we can see patterns, but this is also data. So I can take these data and I can attach them to streets, and I can tell you, of streets that have sidewalks in the Lincoln catchment area, these are the streets with sidewalks that are most heavily utilized. Okay, so we can begin attaching indicators, right? Utilization rates to streets with sidewalks. That tells us a lot about where we might want to place a crosswalk, where we might want to do some design interventions to make streets more passable, or brighter at night, or wider during the day, whatever it is. What routes do you avoid when you're walking or biking? And I make very clear, and our mapping teams make very clear, that these aren't routes that you don't use. These are routes that you go out of your way to avoid. Okay, so you may never walk up there because you don't live up there, and that's fine. Don't draw red up there. Draw red on the routes that you avoid. And what's interesting here, and I think this brings me to a point that I'm going to make a couple of times toward the end of the presentation here, is that there are often streets or locations that are both red and green, or red and blue. That's interesting. Those are sites where there's conflict, right? And I don't mean conflict like there's fighting happening. I mean conflict like kids are conflicted. So whether you like it or not, you're probably walking on Pacific Avenue. You probably don't like it. So you tell me you use it, but when I ask you which streets you'd avoid if you could, Pacific, right? That's a site that we can intervene, where we can intervene, where a small amount of investment might have a huge return on investment, if you want to talk like that. When you're not at home, and you're not at school, and it's during the day, and and it doesn't say that here, but we ask about where kids spend time during the day and at night. So this is where kids spend time during the day. And again, this is that subset of kids. Where do you spend your time? And we asked them here to take out their blue pen and draw outlines around where they spend their time. Some of these things are not surprising. Parks, right? I've been surprised because I wasn't expecting this, that kids, even on up to seniors in high school, tend to go back to the elementary schools that they went to when they were young, if they're still nearby. And I have some thoughts on this. I've talked to some kids about this, and those are the places where they feel comfortable. Those are the places where they feel most like a kid, and that's good, right? Parks, of course, kids are spending time at parks. And we have to adjust when we analyze these data for, we have to compensate for the weight of parks, because those things weigh heavy in kids' minds, and we don't want to overanalyze the fact that kids say they spend time at parks. What's interesting, though, is that, some of the same phenomena occurs. This is Stuart Heights down here. That's Stuart Heights down there. There's sites where kids are spending time, because those are the places where kids spend time. There's sites where kids don't feel terribly comfortable, but those are the places where they spend their time. So what areas do you avoid when you're not at home or school? You can see patterns here. This is among 600 kids. I'm starting to see data from last year, and the patterns look very similar. Tells us a lot about perceptions of neighborhoods, perceptions of areas in the Lincoln catchment area. I'm curious to see what these look like for Foss and Mount Tacoma. Foss and Mount Tacoma were deliberate decisions this year because we are looking to create, ultimately, a continuous set of data for Tacoma. So ultimately, we'll be able to say not just Lincoln, but we can take parts of Lincoln and parts of Mount Tacoma and look at those together. Because again, these aren't maps that stand alone. These are data that we can merge with sets of data next to them to create continuous surfaces for the entire city. And that's really exciting to me. Now, we don't end with maps, and we shouldn't end with maps. One of the questions that always comes up, and I'll just answer it before you ask it, is I don't know why that's red up there. And you shouldn't presume to know why that's red up there either, because the kids drew it. So we don't end with maps. We end with focus groups. And those focus groups are smaller sets of students who get together with poster size maps in the middle of their table, and they talk about that, or that, or that, or that. And they write notes on the poster. And we take notes about what they're talking about. And they share with us, well, this is red because of this, this, or this. Or this is blue because of this, this, or this. Or this street is green because of this, this, or this. That's the nuance. That's the contextual information that is important to understand if we're going to presume to make choices or decisions or investments based on the data that we're generating. That's the final phase. Interestingly, as we're working through that final phase, we can start surfacing opportunities. And that's, again, the point, is to surface opportunities. So there's a couple obvious ones from the neighborhood. We, over and over again, talk to kids about Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park is, it's blue, it's on a green line, but it's red, and it's on a red line. Okay? Lincoln Park is a public green space. It's a park. It's next to a high school. It's where it should be. It doesn't have the greatest reputation amongst kids in Lincoln catchment area. That's a problem. And I don't think would take much to change that. There's reasons that it has a reputation. I think some of them are urban legend. Kids have referred to Lincoln Park as Rape Park. Kids are scared of houses that are around Lincoln Park. Kids don't like how they feel trapped when they're in Lincoln Park. These are things that you bring out, you bring to the surface when you get with smaller groups of kids after you've identified sites that show up both red and green or red and blue. Yeah. Now, at First Creek, there's a lot of activity, right? Something's happening at First Creek pretty soon. The East Side Community Center is being built. Well, I think it's built, it's opening, right? We have uncovered over time that the First Creek neighborhood is generally red. It's generally avoided both by kids who live there and by kids who are not from there. Kids tend to be uncomfortable around First Creek Middle School. It's not a place that they want to be spending time. I call it a public green space over here. I don't know. that it's a swamp. It's not really it's a green space, but nobody can really spend time there. And that's fine. So I wouldn't say it's underutilized necessarily, but I would say it's avoided. It's perceived as unsafe. But unfortunately, it's on a walking route. A lot of kids, most kids, every kid that walks to First Creek Middle School has to walk by this. It's not great for them. They don't enjoy it. But it's there. Now, it's right next to where the Eastside Community Center was built. Right? Eastside Community Center has gone in right above this green space. So this is an opportunity to share with you kind of the long-term vision of the Action Mapping Project data. I can tell you right now that the neighborhood here is red. Right? Eastside Community Center is going in. We would expect, if this community center has the impact that we all hope it has, that next year it's a little less red. And the year after that, it's a little less red. Maybe the year after that, we start seeing some green or some blue. Right? These are longitudinal data that we can use to analyze the impacts of investments, of design decisions that we make in our neighborhoods. That data, again, doesn't exist. The best we can do with something like the community center is talk about how many people are participating in programs. Are we filling our programs? How many people are there at certain times of day on certain days of the week? We can talk about those sorts of data points. We can never really talk about, though, that invisible layer of data, which is, how are kids feeling about this? Do kids want to be there? Is this a red and green space? Is this a red and blue space? Because if it is, then we could probably do better. But we don't know if we can do better because we don't have the data. And that's one of the things that AMP is working towards, is producing those data. So, to start bringing things to a close, why are we doing this? Why am I doing this? I mean, why are any of us doing this? Because we all believe that design matters. But good design can only be effective if it's deployed where it's needed most. As most of us in the room are aware, small neighborhood interventions can be tremendously impactful. A roundabout can have a huge impact on a neighborhood. But with scarce resources, it's really, really difficult, if not impossible, to know exactly where to make those interventions. We're taking our best guess. I don't think anybody is disingenuous when they decide to spend $10,000 here or $10,000 there. But we're guessing. It's a guessing game. I think that we can be more targeted in how we spend those dollars with new sets of data. I want to end with a couple of stories from my experiences with kids, and you may or may not have heard me tell these stories before. Years ago, and it was about 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago, I was working with kids in Salishan. This is a project community, public housing community. And I was working with a group of kids in one of the public spaces during a free lunch program. It was over spring break and then at the beginning of summer. So the kids were hanging out. They had nothing better to do. So they were having free lunch, doing some activities. One of the activities was draw maps of your neighborhoods. Tell us about where you live. And this was me and a couple of students. So we're having kids draw maps of their neighborhoods. Now, Salishan, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of longish, and at one end there's a nice park. It's a decent park, playground stuff, and basketball court. It's nice, open space. Spend time there if I lived over there. Interestingly, the park didn't really show up on any of the maps that kids were drawing at the free lunch program that I was at. Swan Creek Gulch showed up on all of their maps. And so when I started talking to the kids, it's like, what's up with the Gulch? I get it, you're a kid, but so they take me on a walk down to the Gulch, and lo and behold, there's a pretty sweet fort built out of garbage down the bottom of the Gulch. That's where the kids are hanging out. Now, if I was 11 or 12, I'm sure I would want to hang out down there too. But probably I'd also be playing basketball down at the courts. They weren't. They were in the Gulch. And so when we start talking to these kids about, there is literally a sidewalk, there's bike paths from where you are to the park that I can see. Why is this an unknown of your maps? It was simple. They don't belong there. They don't belong there because that's the owner-occupied side of Salishan, in their minds, when I worked with them. They're renters. The park was for the owners, so they don't go there. They go to the Gulch. That's a barrier. That's a matter of access. It's a matter of equity. And we can deal with that. It's not hard to deal with that, but we can't deal with that if we don't know that it exists. The second story that I'll tell happened just a few months ago when I was working with a kid at First Creek Middle School. He was a 6th or 7th grader. He was a very little kid. I like to go to the sessions, the mapping sessions, and hang out and see how things are going and talk to some of the kids that are quiet or kind of on their own. So I'm talking to this kid, and he's showing me his map. And one of the first questions we ask is, get your green pen out and draw an outline around your neighborhood. Whatever you perceive that to be. Could be big, could be small. He had drawn a very tiny little square around what was obviously his house. We asked them to take their green pen and draw a line and trace all the routes that they use. He drew one. It was from his house. He's pretty close, almost adjacent to First Creek, from his house to First Creek. That's the line on his map. Get your red pen and draw red lines along the routes that you avoid. He drew red lines on every single street between his house and First Creek. They bisected his green line, I don't know, 8 times because he had to walk past all those streets. They were all red, though. Now, remember, we have a qualitative question that we ask, and that's how do you feel, right, after school, when you're heading home, when you're doing your thing? A lot of kids write, I feel excited because I'm going to go play video games. I'm energetic because I'm not sitting down anymore. He wrote one word. He wrote hungry, right? So we've got this little kid at First Creek Middle School who walks the gauntlet every day, hungry, to an empty house without access to anything because he's scared to leave his house. And he's hungry. And then he gets up the next morning and does the same thing. That bothers me. Because from where I stand and from what I've been doing over the last 20 years or so, I believe that we all, designers, architects, planners, placemakers, we have a responsibility to do everything that's in our power to ensure that our kids aren't walking home scared and hungry, and that our kids have places to play where they feel like they belong, right? This is access. These are matters of equity. One way to do this is to act on knowledge that we have about our kids' everyday lives. Okay? We need to act on this knowledge. Another way to do this is to empower our youth to become the change that they want to see in their own lives. So with the project, with AMP, this is what I'm doing. I'm working with kids by teaching them, by listening to them, and by giving them those opportunities to become those placemakers of our next generation. And I think I'll end there and open it up. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Kelley. It's very enlightening. So with that, what are your questions?
So I'm an architect and I build buildings.
Yeah.
And buildings are at the ends of the pathways that you're talking about. What can designers and architects do when the area that we shape is fairly limited? How can we open up our buildings so that we're improving what you're talking about? So
this is a good question. I'm not a designer. And this is, I run into this constantly. So what are we supposed to do? I have the same ideas that every other non-designer on the planet might have. I think what's important is that when we're designing, when we can identify those opportunities, we can sit down with the people who are using those spaces. I know what you could do for me, but for youth in particular neighborhoods, and I think that that's really what makes me passionate about a project like this, is that we can't assume that what's right for kids in Wallingford is going to work for kids in East Side. So I think it's a matter of sitting down with kids and understanding some of the spatial dynamics of their everyday lives and asking them those questions. And I'm sure other architects have ideas about how you open up those spaces. One thing I'm really excited about at UW Tacoma in the Urban Studies program is that we're beginning to teach urban design. Because where my project ends is, here, you're an architect. I can tell you some things about the neighborhood you're designing in. I can convene kids. I can bring together the health department and some residents. And then you've got the questions to ask. You have the ideas about how to make this building more accessible, or how the ripples from the investment you make can spread out beyond just the footprint of your building. So others may be able to chime in here. I apologize, I don't.
Aaron, you going to chime in?
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you. Really appreciate your talk, Matt. That was both informative and inspirational. So my question for you is about the part of your process that you call the focus group. What do you do with the information that you get out of the focus group?
Yeah. So the focus group results in a couple different types of information. One are big pieces of paper with things written all over them. The other is notes from the students. Each one of those pieces of information, whether it's a sentence or a word, we can geotag, so attach spatial coordinates to. If they're talking about, well, let me go back here. If we're talking about this up here, then we can begin building what's essentially a word cloud for that up there, attaching whatever information that kids have shared with us to that piece of the east side. That information then we can tease themes out of. So with enough information, you can start to understand, and it's usually not a lot that you need to know. So just knowing that kids feel trapped when they're inside Lincoln Park, that there's some myth about it being rape park and that the houses make them uncomfortable, is enough to, I think, again, not a designer, but I think it's enough to help professionals, architects, designers, to think about how to intervene. And that's, this part of the project is still in development, right? We're going to roll this out in a real way summer of 2019, so next summer. Right now, we've only piloted these workshops. Next summer, we'll be rolling them out, and I'll be inviting, I'm sure, folks in this room to participate as designers. So I think it's still an evolution.
You mentioned one interesting thing about solutions, and it may be different for certain kids in this neighborhood versus this neighborhood, or even demographic differences. And so I wonder if in the focus group you don't ask a question and create a word cloud about why that's red, but maybe you ask another question that is, if you had a magic wand, what would you do differently in this area? And you create a word cloud that starts to generate solutions from their point of view.
Yep. And that's, so I've been talking to the health department about what's called participatory budgeting. And part of the plan here is that in the summer at our I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately named AMP camps, we'll be running participatory budgeting exercises in which we're going to ask the kids and youth and adults to work together to think about solutions, to not just tell us why it's red, but what would make that better. And I don't think that it would be terribly effective for a group of non-architects and designers to sit in a room and do that on their own. I think having someone like you sit there and be a sounding board. So what's possible? If we don't know what's possible, given budget constraints, then kids are going to come up with all kinds of harebrained ideas, but we need to rein them in and think about what's realistic. And that's the last stage of this project is the stage that hasn't happened yet, that will happen next summer. And that's the stage I'm most excited about, because that's a stage where we produce a plan and we've hopefully identified a funding source for that plan. I don't expect to have much money, but I think even $5,000 or $10,000 to invest in each neighborhood shows these kids that their efforts lead to something. And having an architect or a designer sitting at the table when we're thinking about these plans makes it that much more real, because we're not going to walk out of there with me writing down, kids want water fountain and less trees. We need somebody to draw that, make it look like an actual design. So yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Kelley, hey, appreciate this awesome presentation again. Chat a little bit about, a couple years ago, we did a Safe Streets presentation. We did some asset mapping type of thing, and Stewart and Lincoln were two of those things that were during it. And some of the things on the Lincoln with the park where you spoke about were about when they did it, they said, wow, here's a park, there's no lighting, there's trees, there's things like that make it an area that we want to avoid in our walk. Yeah. So kind of my question to you is, what's next in that? Once you capture all that data, is it something that's fed to the city and said, hey, we've kind of seen this area to make it a place that those kids around Lincoln, especially with the Lincoln revitalization project going on, how do we make that a place in that park that no longer do they want to avoid, but they actually want to walk through?
Sure. So one of the struggles that neighborhood groups have, neighborhood advocates have, is that when I show up to council as me and say, we need more lights in Lincoln Park, it's real easy to say, good on you, it's a good idea. It's anecdotal, right? My kids feel uncomfortable at Lincoln Park because there's not enough lights. So do my neighbors and my other friend. It's anecdotal. It's very easy to ignore someone who has some harebrained idea. And that is something that community groups, whether you're in California, in Los Angeles, or in West Philadelphia, or in Tacoma, you run up against that. Without data to support the claims that you make, all you've got are loud voices and anecdotal evidence, stories that you tell. What we're generating are data. It's impossible to ignore if we've surveyed 3,000 kids for 2 straight years and Lincoln Park turns up red, blue, and green all 3 years. That's data. You can't ignore that anymore. And that makes me excited. Now, so what do we do with that data? Well, the data, I'm not claiming ownership over the data. The university isn't claiming ownership over the data. Kids are helping to generate this data. We've got a pretty snazzy back end. And by back end, I mean we've got a server and a web application that's being built by some of our graduate students that'll serve these data. You want to go in and stratify your data and pull down just Caucasian youth under the age of 13 in Lincoln, then we'll provide you that ability so that you can take those data and walk out to whoever your organization is that you're advocating for funding from and say, look, here's the data to support what I'm saying. Because as unfortunate as it is, your voice is not enough. We can get together. A lot of people make enough noise. Maybe that gets change done, but not everybody can do that. But data makes all the difference. Thank you. Yeah. And yes, that 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I don't know, you were a part of, it was many years ago. Very first.
Not that many.
Well, I don't know. I began running this project with Safe Streets several years ago in neighborhoods. So it's been a while.
These are great questions. Keep them coming. Make eye contact with me in between. Who's next? There we go. I knew it.
Just out of curiosity, the extent of data that you've collected so far, I mean, I think it's a fantastic endeavor that you've created here. And what's the extent of the boundaries that you've currently collected data from, and where do you plan to go with that? I mean, how far is that boundary going to be expanded?
Yeah. So I mentioned just briefly that I'm using catchment areas as neighborhoods. So the extent of our data collection will be to the city of Tacoma, the Tacoma Public School District. So right now we've got Lincoln complete, and that'll happen again this year, the year after. So this is a sustainable project that we're building. So the goal is that we establish centers that will produce these data every year for catchment areas. There'll be 5 catchment areas ultimately: Lincoln, Foss, Mount Tahoma, Wilson, and Stadium. Those will be our 5 mapping centers. Each one of those centers will capture data for its catchment area. Stadium's the most complicated because they got to go across the water. But we'll have a continuous set of data that looks like this for the entire city. That's very cool. And I don't know if I didn't make this clear, and it's a hard point to make, but ultimately I'll be able to tell you, or you'll be able to tell yourself, because you can pull the data down and do it yourself. You can tell me the utilization rate for parks in Lincoln relative to the average utilization for parks across the entire city, relative to utilization of parks in Stadium, because these are comparable data, right? They're data that exist for the entire region. I can tell you who's using sidewalks in Lincoln versus who's using, or how many sidewalks are being used in Mount Tahoma catchment area. So the ability to look at matters of equity and access across parts of our city, across neighborhoods in our city, is pretty mind-blowing once the project builds out, supposing it does. And there's a lot that has to get figured out between now and then. 15,000 pieces of paper being digitized every year is massive. And the only way it happens is if we have high school students staffing those mapping teams doing that legwork, because to digitize a map takes about 10 to 15 minutes. So we're scaling that up relative to the size of our mapping teams. So it's a lot of work.
How do you choose the students that are on your mapping teams?
I don't. They self-select. So, not really. Well, yeah, they do. I'm working with, and so digitizing, analyzing. This is the hardest part. Right now, that's what I'm meeting tomorrow at FOSS to try to figure this out. We have. I'm working with Career and Technical Education. So John Page at the school district is the director of Career and Technical Education. Great guy who's very passionate about the project and has connected me with some very good teachers at Mount T, FOSS, and Lincoln. Now we have to figure out how we recruit students because we're asking students to get involved in something that's really exciting but it's kind of opaque. So we've got some posters that we're putting up. There's talking points we're giving to teachers. We're incentivizing participation by, there's two options, and there's some debate about which we'll use. Either kids can earn credit, high school credit, for participating on the projects, or they'll earn stipends. And we'll feed them every time they come. Because we're asking them to be there, this year at least, we're asking kids to come 3 to 5 p.m. 2 days a week. So we'll be buying some pizza during those hours. And we'll see. I don't know. I mean, this frightens me more than standing up in front of 100 groups of middle schoolers. I don't fully know how to recruit, but teachers and staff have been really generous, and they have good ideas. If anybody has ideas, talk to me. Love to hear them.
So bringing it back to design too, then, are there ideas or ways that you can make it a little bit more micro-focused on buildings or other specific areas, or do you still want to keep it broad?
So when you say make it focused on buildings, you mean talk about a building in particular?
Correct.
Well, funny you should ask. I worked with McGranahan, with Aaron, a couple of years ago now when they were redesigning Bernie Elementary. And for that project, I went into Bernie and ran the same sort of exercise, but rather than a base map of the neighborhood, I showed up with a floor plan of the high school that included the outside part of the high school. So it was like the parcel as well as the floor plan, and asked kids the same sorts of questions. These were younger kids, 3rd and 4th graders, I think. Was it 3rd and 4th graders? Do you remember? 4th and 5th? Yeah, well, it was an interesting project. The visualization was very different. For an area that small, and we were talking about rooms rather than outlines of spaces. So the visualization ended up looking, well, really we colored rooms based on response rate. So some rooms were bright green, some rooms were bright red. And that reflected how kids felt in those rooms, the rooms they spent more time in, less time in. I think it was successful. I think that we need to do that a couple of more times to really refine the methods. But it's an interesting idea to do kind of a micro-focused participatory sketch mapping process like this. I don't know. Aaron might have other thoughts on it, but I was satisfied with the outcomes. We ran that project with, good God, what, 60, 80 kids in that lunchroom? Maybe over 100 4th and 5th graders during lunchtime. It was me, my graduate student, and Aaron, and some teachers, but it was chaos. I mean, we got good data, and we learned a lot. It's possible, but I think we need to refine methods.
Aaron, you want to take that, how it informed your design?
It was experimental. No, we had never undertaken a process like that. But from that data, we presented it to our design committee, who are teachers, principal, district leadership, and parents. And we understood what it is from a kid's perspective that they find enticing about school. This was our guiding question in the new design, because attendance is a struggle there, parent participation is a struggle, so enticing students to see school differently, to see it a place they want to be, they want to engage in their learning. We looked at the spaces that were, for the most part, enticing to them. And so those were the spaces that received the most attention. Those were the spaces that we enhanced in the design, and we made featured spaces. We tried to make accessible to the different populations. It's a school for deaf and hard of hearing, so that played a part. Don't know how successful that's going to be, but it would be interesting to map the new design and kind of compare student reactions to it.
Yeah.
So I'll talk to you in 3 years.
Yeah.
Got time for a couple more.
So, Matt, comparing from what you have done, looking at the more like this portion of a city map compared to just inside the building, do you think it seems to me it's probably more effective that the two is actually combined? How the school function in kids' mind, whether it's actually a place that they want to gather on, how they go to school and how they go back from school. So, but not in this big of an area, but more focused on how that school is actually working for the neighborhood. What do you think about that? Is that better than much larger or much smaller scale? But it's kind of in the middle, but it's more focused on a certain place and how that place is actually affecting the neighborhood and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, smaller is always, in my mind, I'd love to focus even more and more and more, because I find problematic regional indicators. I find problematic stories about cities. I think it's much more important to talk about small areas, neighborhoods, because those are the sorts of interventions that can be most effective. So, zooming in so that kids in Stewart were drawing right around Stewart rather than the entire catchment area. Is that what you're? So the issue there is that kids come from all over the catchment area. I mean, the kids that go to Stewart don't necessarily live right next to Stewart. So there was, and even as it stands, this is about the edges of, this isn't actually the full catchment area. I've clipped this, but the catchment area that we use is a half a mile buffered around the actual catchment area, because I found that kids want to talk about what's happening beyond the edges. There's something we talk about in cartography and spatial analysis called edge effects. I'm looking at Allie because I'm going to give my definition and he's going to tell me tomorrow, oh, God, what'd you do? But on the edges of maps, we tend to see weird things happening because our lives don't end where the catchment area ends. So there's a balance right now. I'm using 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. Right, so I'm constrained by the size of the paper that I'm using. I'm constrained by what you can actually see, depending on how much you scale out, how much you scale in. The further I scale in, the kids don't actually have that much more to say in the micro areas. What they really want to talk about are those parts of their neighborhood that they spend time in. So it would be an interesting experiment. And I think there's room as we build out. This is one of the functions of the community mapping centers that I'm excited about. They're tasked with not just generating the data and running the workshops, but also analyzing, right? So I think there's opportunities here for 2-3 years down the road when we have like the Lincoln Center. Once that's 2 or 3 years old and they know how things are working there and we've got experienced students, we can task them with something like, let's run an experiment. Let's talk to Stewart kids using a more narrowly scaled map and see what kind of results we get. I don't know that kids are going to have a whole lot more to say. This is also something that can happen at a design intervention. So if you're going to run a charrette or if you're going to run some kind of a collaborative session in the summertime, and we decide that Lincoln Park is what we're going to focus on, we can bring a map of Lincoln Park with the immediate neighborhood around it and ask our small group of kids, as well as the adults and the designers present, to tell us what they think about that neighborhood. And I think then you're going to get much more nuanced, focused drawing. For generating the big data that I'm generating, I'm walking that line between being too focused and being too broad. And I think catchments kind of work. Because kids, I know that all the kids in the Lincoln catchment area, well, about 95% at least are familiar with this area. Some kids are bussed in. They don't live there, so they don't have anything to say. But most kids know the area.
Excellent. So with that, I want to remind everybody that we're going over to the Swiss, and you'll have an opportunity. Hopefully we can entice Professor Kelley over for a little while.
Yep. I have to go pick up one of my kids later, but I'm good for a while.
Perfect. And Ben, you're okay holding on to your question until then? Perfect. All right. So with that, let's give one more round of applause.
Thank you.